So we have Josh to start with. Josh is postdoctoral research fellow in political and international studies at the University of Warwick and a member of the interdisciplinary ethics research group. His research focuses on epistemology and moral philosophy, particularly the philosophy of trust, expertise, and technology, as well as aesthetics, specifically the relationship between moral and aesthetic values and the application of AI to art. Quite a difficult subject. His postdoc projects at Warwick include moral obligation and epistemology, the case of vaccine hesitancy, GEMS, gaming ecosystem, AdSol, addressing social technical limitation of LLMs for medical and social computing, and artificial intelligence, show me story about AI. Floor is yours. Josh is also part of our GEMS project.
Thanks, thanks, Maya.
Thanks.
So I'm going to be talking about a paper that Nevin and I are working on, which looks at a game that was designed by the British government called Pathways. And the aim of this game was to essentially try to educate young people and engage with them about the harms and legal consequences of extremism. This game failed to achieve this goal. It was rejected by gamers and on the online community in general. And the aim of the paper is to work out why exactly the game failed. What exactly was it about the game that meant that it wasn't taken very seriously by the people who engaged with it? And our broad argument is that the game has a moralistic and educational aim, and this came at the expense of the aesthetic and ludological purpose that games have. And so the game doesn't really feel like a game or doesn't really function like a game. So as I said, this game was designed by a company called Shout Out UK, along with two UK councils, and it was funded in part by the Home Office. And it presents itself as a role-playing game in which players are presented with various scenarios involving extremism in some way, and it asks for their responses. How would you respond to this scenario? And the game also includes a radicalization meter that goes up or down or stays in the middle, depending on the choices that you make. Roughly speaking, there's an obviously good option, which is usually just ignore the content or refuse to engage with it. The obvious bad option is direct endorsement, and the middle option sort of varies between slightly agreeing to sort of taking a sort of detached or bystander approach to what's going on. As I said, the game did receive quite a backlash online, and a lot of this focused on a character in the game called Amelia, who is the villain of the game, I suppose. So she's a right-wing extremist, and she presents the character with some of the extremist rhetoric that they can endorse or reject. And she's presented as a kind of gamer girl. She has purple hair and piercings. And as part of the backlash, she was used as in memes like the one on the screen, and essentially made into a kind of hero defending British rights. And so she was sort of subverted in that sense, because in the game, she's the villain because she's doing this, but the way in which she was sort of reclaimed as part of the backlash was as someone who was championing these values. And criticisms of the game largely centered on the argument that Pathways doesn't really play like a game, feels like gaming is being exploited by the government in order to just, send political messages out to gamers. And so this is what we kind of want to understand. Why does the game feel when you play it not like it's not really a game? And the rough argument of the paper is that an effective role-playing game is meant to allow players to explore different actions and their consequences in a sort of playful environment. And we argue that the pedagogical and moralistic aims of Pathways prevent this kind of exploration. And in consequence, the game really does fail as a role-playing game, and maybe even can't really be described as a role-playing game given how the game functions. And I'll end with some possible ways in which you might try and design a similar game, but that avoids this kind of problem. So the kind of aesthetic framework that we apply, so we understand games as an art form, and one of the central values of art is that it allows you, whether it's a novel or a film, to explore different perspectives in a playful way, which is to say that when you're watching a film, for example, you're given a vision of what the world might look like from a different point of view, and you can imaginatively connect with that or understand it, because it's not real life, it's just art, it's just a fiction or a narrative. Now, when it comes to games, they also allow this kind of exploration, but in a different way. In particular, in a narrative role-playing game, you're given different ways that you might act. In a simplistic moral game, you might be able to act in just a good way or a bad way. And these ways of acting, the kind of fancy term for that is agential mode. So games allow you to explore these different ways of acting. So if you were to play a role-playing game as a hero, you would then take those actions, and then the game world would change based off of the good choices that you've made. Whereas if you were to choose a villainous approach, the game world would change based off of those things. But the important thing for a role-playing game is that you can still win the game as a hero or a villain. It's just that the game world will change and look different depending on what path you choose to explore. And so that's the value of games, is to allow people to explore these different ways of acting and their consequences. Now, obviously, art is about play and entertainment to a large degree, but art can have moral aims and it can have pedagogical aims. We use games to teach people things all the time, and artworks to teach things all the time. But the risk that artworks face when they have such aims is that they can become didactic. And didacticism in general is seen as a kind of aesthetic defect. You want to avoid this when you have moral or educational aims in your artworks. And essentially, what that means when a work is didactic, what that means is that the author or the authorial voice or the designer's voice in a game context intrudes on the fictive world to essentially tell the audience what to think. And so you're no longer really in a fictive world exploring different perspectives. You can feel the presence of the author or designer saying, actually, you should think this thing in the real world. And so there are two ways that a work can be didactic in that way. The first is when the author just directly addresses the audience to tell them what to think. You could think of an Aesop's fable as a good example of this. Those fables typically end with the moral lesson that you're supposed to take from the story. So slow and steady wins the race in the tortoise and the hare. But they can also be a little bit more subtle. They don't have to directly address the audience. Sometimes you engage with an artwork and you're taken out of your immersion of the artwork because you can tell that the world is incredibly convoluted, and it's convoluted because the author is trying to get across a moral point. And so examples of that might be when you read a book, for example, where the characters feel not really like characters, but like self-inserts for the author's political opponents or political heroes or something like that. Or an artwork where there are lots of plot contrivances, and those contrivances exist because the author is clearly trying to make a moral or political point rather than trying to create a believable world. So the idea here is a work is didactic when those moral or educational purposes come at the expense of the fictive plausibility of the world. So applying this thinking to role-playing games then, what would make a role-playing game didactic? There are a lot of things we could talk about, but the main ones, especially for pathways, seem to be these three. Firstly, the game can just include these direct addresses that are addressed to the player instead of the character. So instead of choosing a course of action in a game and then watching that unfold to your character, the game would essentially pause itself to tell you, the player, what the moral consequences are. So that would be one example of didacticism. Another example would be when the actions and consequences that you take, again, are designed more to express or illuminate some moral or educational point at the expense of immersion in the world and believability. And we'll see how Pathways does that in a number of ways. And the last way that a game might do this is by creating a false sense of autonomy. It's very important in a role-playing game that you can actually finish the game by taking multiple pathways. If the game actually only has one winning pathway, it's not really a role-playing game in that sense, because although you can choose to do things in a different way, you'll be penalized. You won't be able to win the game. So in that case, the game turns away from a role-playing game and is more like some kind of, in this case, in the case of Pathways, a kind of moral quiz, where the aim is not to explore different ways of doing things, but to work out what the morally correct answer is in each scenario. So those are the key ways that a game can be didactic. I'm now going to look at four ways in which the Pathways game falls into this trap. So the first thing about Pathways is that it provides you with these three options, except regardless of the option that you choose, at the end of the game, your character gets a referral to Prevent. This seems like an odd ending if all you've done throughout the game is refuse to engage with any kind of extremist content. You would think that in that case, you would avoid a Prevent referral because you haven't done anything problematic in that regard. And so there's a sense in which when you're playing then that if all of the options just lead to this referral, that the game is little more than an excuse for the designers to tell you about Prevent. And so that's one way in which the game just feels like a didactic exercise aimed at teaching you about this organization rather than meaningfully exploring different actions and pathways and their consequences. The second example is that the game does include these direct addresses to the player, warning them about the illegal consequences of doing certain things. So in this scenario on the screen, the player character comes across a video online and you're asked whether you would download it or not. And in this case, as you can see from the radicalization meter there, it's still green. So you've chosen to not download the video. Nevertheless, the player is then warned that in the real world, if you download certain things, you can receive a terrorist conviction. Now, it makes sense that the designers would want to mention this because the game is an educational game, but it's doing so didactically. It's not revealing this information through a story or through the game itself. It's just providing this as an aside to the player, which immediately takes them out of the exploration of different scenarios. The third example is a bit more complicated. So sometimes the game provides you with actions and scenarios that just don't seem very believable or grounded in what would happen if you actually did these actions. And when that happens, you're left thinking as a player, well, clearly this is designed more to sort of emotionally get me to do a certain thing rather than to create a believable scenario. And as an example of this, there's one scenario where you come across a statistic online that says something to the effect of veterans are losing their homes to asylum seekers or losing temporary housing to asylum seekers or something like that. And the player is described as being somewhat skeptical of this claim. And you're then asked whether you would, I think, repost it, which would be the bad option, to ignore it and carry on scrolling, which is the good option, or to essentially do some fact checking, which is the middle ground option. Now, if you choose the good option, which is to carry on scrolling, you get the scenario on the left here, which is that you just happen to come across in the very next thing that you look at a video of a veteran and a dog moving into their home that's been provided by a community initiative. And this immediately defeats all of your anxiety and everything's fine. And this doesn't seem very believable in the sense that that's not really how the internet works. If you're in some kind of funnel online where you're looking at extremist content, the chances that you would then come across immediately a video that disproves that statistic is very unlikely. And so it seems like what the game is just trying to do here is by providing you with this unrealistic positive scenario when you do the thing that the game designers want, which is to ignore the content, you get this positive outcome, which is that you're no longer deceived. But because it's not very believable, actually, as a player, it has the opposite effect because you see it as an attempt to sort of manipulate you rather than an attempt to provide a reasonable scenario or a plausible scenario. If you choose the middle ground option, which, as I said, is fact checking, the consequence of this is that you then just go on loads of right-wing extremist websites, engage with some illegal groups, and just believe everything that you see. And again, this isn't very plausible, although it's true that, doing your own research online can be dangerous because there is a lot of misinformation. It's not very realistic to think that you would necessarily just find these websites immediately. Also, bearing in mind that your character was described as being skeptical in the original scenario, so it's not clear why they would necessarily then just accept the stuff that they find, and also unclear why they wouldn't just go on a website like the BBC and check there, like if there was something that website had in terms of its fact checking. So again, you have these two scenarios which have consequences that are very contrived, and their contrivance is based upon the fact that the designers want to encourage you as the player to focus on this good example of just not engaging, because even in the middle ground option, it often treats it as just a necessary pathway to you being radicalized, just as not quite to the level of the full extremist options, but to some degree pretty similar. And the final example of didacticism in the game
Five
is that,
minutes.
no problem, is that it ends with a sort of non-game info dump on what Prevent is, the organization Prevent. And this isn't told all through the gameplay at all. It's just a big long bit about what Prevent is and what it does. And again, it makes sense that they would want to do this because it is an educational game. But at that point, given that you've gone through this game and now you're just getting this big long um, description about Prevent, again, it encourages that thought when you're playing that this game is really just an excuse to give you this information. So it's not really a game in that sense. Another problem with this description is it's also sometimes out of sync with the game or contradicts it. So in this particular slide, they mention that Prevent is ideologically neutral. They focus on all kinds of radicalization, and they present this image of lots of different people to sort of reinforce that idea. But actually, when you play the game, you can only play as a white person, and the only kind of extremism you encounter is right-wing extremism. And part of the backlash was from people who think that the government is sort of going against British values and problematizing the people who care about British values. And the game sort of vindicates that narrative to some degree by problematizing one kind of radicalization and not focusing on the other kinds of radicalization. So these two sides of the game sometimes are also just in tension with each other. Um, in addition to the didactic problems, I'll also briefly look at some pedagogical failures as well in the game. So these are just failures to do with the game trying to teach people about radicalization, but just not doing so in a very effective way. The first way that it does this is that it is very vague sometimes when it sets up the scenarios. So in the case where you download the video, the only information you're given about this video is that it seems off or is slightly concerning. So it's not really clear how a player can meaningfully explore actions when they're not really told in detail what they're engaging with. Is this just offensive content? Is this someone saying we should go and attack someone? You know, there are various kinds of ways in which something can be concerning, and it's important to be clear on what that is. Another example of this is when the game tells you about, say, the potential legal consequences of your actions. It's again not very specific. I mean, what certain content are we talking about that could lead to this kind of conviction? If you want to educate people on these matters, you want to be more specific so that they can actually know the detail of what could get them into trouble. So those are essentially the key flaws of the game. And as I said, we do consider briefly some ways that similar games could be made or designed in such a way as to avoid these kinds of problems, to avoid didacticism in particular. So the first thing that you could do is to fictionalize your scenarios. So you would do this by abstracting away from the real world examples of radicalization in such a way that you could project any kind of radicalization onto the game. And the reason why you would do that is that if you create a scenario that's detached enough from real world examples, you encourage people to enter that mode of playful exploration because they're not seeing this as, okay, you're just problematizing me or someone like me. You're presenting a different scenario, and I can detach from the real world and my biases there and think about this from a sort of new perspective. And then after you've played the game, you can then do the connecting of the dots and say, oh, actually, well, this actually seems quite similar to these things that go on in the real world. So that would be one way that you could try to improve the game design. Also, making sure that you reflect the subtlety and nuance of the real world and its consequences. So I mentioned earlier about how sometimes the scenarios come across as contrived and not very believable. It's important to make sure that those things are believable so that people feel like you're actually telling a cohesive narrative in the game rather than exploiting the narrative to make some moral or educational point. Obviously, it's important as well that the cases in the game should be informative, and that if you are providing educational content in the game, they're presented through the game itself as much as is possible, and trying to avoid too many didactic asides. And the last thing is just that it's important to make sure that the consequences and scenarios are consistent and make sense. So I mentioned the character of Amelia. Now she's presented initially in the game as as a stranger to the player, and eventually she becomes your friend. And the game tries to set up a sort of tension between keeping this friend and doing the right thing. Now that would make sense if you've picked the bad options or the middle ground options where you sort of agree with Amelia a bit or fully. But if you pick the ignore this person option to begin with, it's not clear that you would actually become friends with this character at all. And so that's a way in which the game stretches believability and why it's very important if you're going to create these kinds of games to consider consistency across the different options rather than just trying to create these very contrived scenarios, which is what we get in the game. So that's it for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Josh. And this is coming out, isn't it? Have you submitted it, guys?
No, still writing, but
It's still
it's
writing, but
we've
it's
got
going
a
to be
reasonable draft of it, so hopefully it'll be submitted
it's
soon.
going to be another publication that will be available to everybody to